In simple, practical terms, though, what can a cost of living committee made up of opposition MPs actually do?
Well, it's not just opposition MPs. I should say that. There are Greens senators and there are also members of the Labor Senate as well that are members of this cost of living committee. What we're looking for is implementable and practical solutions that perhaps people may not have thought about. Things like reductions in red tape, improving competition, reducing regulation, and also there's opportunities to do things like remove tax barriers to encourage investment, to improve competition in something like energy. We know that supply is one of the big issues, as it is in housing. So how do we open up more supply of housing to bring down costs for all Australians? Because let's face it, when inflation is high, the cost of living will keep increasing. And right now, that core inflation is more than double the RBA's 2 to 3% band. And the government seems to have turned over the responsibility for reducing the cost of living to the Reserve Bank. The Reserve Bank only has one tool in the shed. It's only got interest rates. So that keeps ratcheting up the cost of living, trying to bring down inflation. We want to find implementable practical solutions that the government can implement to reduce its pressure on inflation. And that way, that's the only sustainable way to bring down the cost of living for all Australians.
I know you've not started on this yet, but what are you hearing anecdotally about how tough it is for people out there? I'm in Sydney at the moment, and where I'm actually staying at the moment, I've just been quite surprised at the number of homeless people who are sleeping out rough in the streets, which in a city as wealthy as Sydney, I just shake my head when I see that and think to myself, what's Australia doing to these people? So what are you hearing about how hard people are actually doing it right now, Senator?
Some of the statistics that we're hearing are really quite confronting, and particularly from the charities and not-for-profit sectors. And we've been hearing a lot from organisations like Food Bank and the Salvation Army and St Vincent de Paul, things like the increased demand for services from financial counsellors because people are finding themselves in debt that they simply can't find a way out of. Food Bank has seen such an explosion in demand for their services because people can't afford to put food on the table anymore. In fact, one of the food charities, when we said to them, look, what's the one thing that the government could do to help you, because there've been such incredible demand for their services for ordinary, sometimes two-income families, and they said if they could bring down interest rates, that would make a difference, because all of a sudden they're seeing families with mortgages for the first time asking for the help from charities because of that increased cost of living. That's really confronting, and it should be a wake-up call for government that this is their number one priority. Reducing the cost of living must be the number one priority, because unless you can bring down inflation, well, then you're simply going to see your purchasing power eroded, your savings eaten up, and your standard of living reduced. And if a government has one responsibility, it's to improve the standard of living for the population.
Well, talking about numbers, we see today in the Sunday papers the Treasurer next week, Jim Chalmers, he's expected to release the intergenerational report. Now, I was quite surprised when I heard that this report throws ahead up to 40 years, but it is expected to show huge amounts of money ballooning in government spending over those next 40 years, particularly on aged care, because we're getting, as a nation, older, healthcare, which always soaks up so much of our budget. The NDIS just seems, we all are largely supportive of the NDIS, but there are parts of it being rorted, as Bill Shorten's told us, and that's going to start draining our coffers as well, plus defence. So 140 billion is the estimate that we'll have to raise extra each year between now and those 40 years. That's almost impossible task without a complete change to the way the economy's run, isn't it?
Well, it does sound to me like a Trojan horse for raising taxes, an excuse to not go ahead with those stage 3 tax cuts. I mean, let's face it, this, whatever we've seen from the intergenerational report, and you're right, we've only seen a little bit of it so far, is nothing new. In fact, the intergenerational report from only 2 years ago because Jim Chalmers has brought forward the intergenerational report. Used to be every 5 years, now it's once every term of government. It's actually no real new news here. And not only that, but the budget said the same, that we knew that aged care, that the NDIS and that health were going to be the three biggest costs to the budget. What it doesn't do, unfortunately, is provide any solutions, particularly to things like growing the economy, so that as a proportion of the economy, those additional costs aren't a growing proportion of the economy. So I think that's a real concern. With the NDIS, you're absolutely right. The costs are skyrocketing. In the last term of government, we did propose some reforms to the NDIS, which were knocked back by the government. Of course, now that Labor are in power, they've looked at the NDIS and realised that it is out of control. It's growing at around 14% per annum. Now, what they've decided to do and what they announced in the budget in May is that they would reduce those costs to only 8% per annum. Problem is, there were no policies to back up that promise. It was just pulled out of thin air. They've said, oh, that's right, we'll work that out at a conference that we're going to do in November. Well, you can't budget that way. You can't say, we're going to put a price cap on it or, a cost cap on it. That's not how budgets work. So let's see some policies that are actually going to reduce the NDIS. The good news is, and this is really important to understand, that Peter Dutton has said that we will work with the government to reform the NDIS to make sure that it is sustainable into the future, because it is profoundly important. He's also said that about aged care, because we know that the cost of aged care is going to increase. We want to make sure that aged care and the NDIS are sustainable into the future, so that all Australians that need aged care, all Australians that need the NDIS can get the services that they need and deserve. But in order to do that, you're going to have to make some hard decisions. We will help them with that. But they seem to have knocked back the offer.
Senator Hume, good luck on your listening tour. I appreciate your time tonight. We'll talk again soon.